All right, this is Wil Reilly live on the Break It Down show with Pete Turner. Good to be here. Been here a couple times. How are you, man?
I am good. It's a Saturday morning. We've got an interesting conversation to have here. We got a little bit of groundwork, though. We owe the audience because not everybody knows the show. Not everybody's been familiar with the work. So let's spend a minute defining terms and understanding the bona fides. Why on earth is a political scientist allowed to speak intelligently upon the lack of or the actions of the government in terms of empirical data?
Well, I think there are a couple of different things here. So I teach political science. I'm a quantitative social scientist at a state university at Kentucky State. And one of my roles in that job is teaching a lot of our quantitative methods courses, research methods, things like that have a statistical foundation. So when it comes to criticizing an expert in their field, there are a couple of levels. I wouldn't presume to argue with a doctor about a purely medical point around COVID-19 or anything else. If a doctor said, I believe this virus can be transmitted aerosolically through the air or through touch of a hand to hard surfaces, I wouldn't be in a position to challenge that. However, it also has to be recognized that doctors aren't necessarily better quantitative methodologists than physicists or political scientists. They're not necessarily better executive leaders by any means than governors or generals or master sergeants. So there are other considerations that come into play when you're talking about these medical issues. My main point on COVID-19, I became involved in the conversation to the point of commenting on methodological pieces or bantering on Twitter. And this later became, I recently put out an article in Spiked, large circulation British magazine. And it looks like that's going to become a fairly serious journal piece. But what led to me getting involved in the conversation was strictly my questions about the mathematics that were being used by some of these physicians and some of these epidemiologists. So nothing really medical going on. But our response to COVID-19, and Pete, we've talked about this off air, was driven in part by an almost panicked response to two mathematical projections. One was the World Health Organization's projection that COVID-19 could kill 3.4% of all people. That was the death rate among anyone who might be infected. The second was a paper by a guy named Neil Ferguson, nice guy by all accounts, British methodologist, but he estimated that 2 million people could die in the United States in this set of scenarios where we did nothing to mitigate the disease, one. Two, 80% of people eventually got the bug, not 20 or 50 or the rates you more commonly see during epidemics. And three, the death rate was essentially 1%. It was right around there. It was quite high. So in response to these sort of doomsday projections, 3 or 4% of all people die, or only 1% of all people die, but everyone gets it and we do very little to respond, we saw extreme responsive behavior when it came to COVID-19. And a lot of people, including not just myself, but I mean, Dr. John Ioannidis and his team over at Stanford, many people writing in sort of the tech sector, people began to question, are some of these things accurate? Are these projections real? What we now see is that the current IMHE model, which takes social distancing into account, predicts about 70,000 total deaths in the USA from COVID-19. And I think it's fair to say that's what a lot of quants, a lot of methodologists in the business world, military sector, by the way, civilian tech, kind of predicted. I mean, and that is a situation where you want to be right. Obviously, no one wants 1 million people to die. But those are the areas where a lot of general scientists disagreed with some of the medical projections. It's not the question of does a doctor best know how to use a ventilator? It's the question of, well, when you're saying 4% death rate, what's that based on? And quick final comment on that. One of the things that was apparent early on, and this produced, again, in terms of the elite general press, this produced a column in the Journal, editorial, I believe, lead editorial. But one of the things that became apparent was that we had what's called a denominator problem. So those estimates of 1 to 3% death rates weren't made up. I'm not impugning anyone's integrity here in the least, but they came, as far as I understand, from the death rates that had been seen or projected to that point. And the problem with that is that the pool of people that were taking COVID-19 tests was extraordinarily unrepresentative. In the United States, until quite recently, to take a COVID-19 test, and I know this because I tried to, you had to meet a couple of conditions. You had to be sick and symptomatic. So you had to be coughing. You had to be visibly ill to the point where, in my case, as an adult male, you would try to go to the doctor. Two, you had to have had actual close contact with someone who previously had been diagnosed with COVID-19. And at one point in Kentucky, as I understand, they were calling these people. This wasn't just you saying, funky flu. And three, you had to call a hospital and go through about a 30-minute screener to take these tests. So, I mean, a large number of the people taking the COVID-19 tests were inpatients in hospitals. Mm-hmm. Almost all of them were visibly sick. So when you say that 3% of those people died, that's not necessarily surprising. And if you talk to a family practice physician or just a buddy who was a doctor around this time, many doctors were saying, look, we're sending 50 people home. We're telling people just to shelter in place for every person that we actually test in this sort of arduous manner. And what that would mean is that the IFR, the infection fatality rate for the disease, is much, much lower than was projected because we know the deaths, but we're taking that number of deaths and comparing it to a much larger population of sick people than we originally thought. And when we started doing what are called randomized serological tests, we found that this is exactly the case. And I don't think, the methods community is trying to take credit for this. I mean, we all just want people to live. But I mean, there have been large tests done in Bonn, in Germany, for example. That test found that 15% of people had or had recently COVID-19. That would place the death rate for the disease, the IFR, at around 0.37%. We had a similar test very well done in the USA. As I understand, they used a very low false positive test from, I think, Decode Genetics. This was in Miami. 7% of people roughly tested positive. That would put the IFR there at about 0.2%. So I think that the comment that came from many people with a general stats background is you have to resolve this denominator question, or we don't know what the death rate for the disease is. That's the point that was being made on methods blogs and so on. It wasn't the doctors don't know how to care for someone in a hospital room. I want to be clear about that.
That's fair. When we look at the silo expertise of a doctor versus the more multifaceted expertise of a political scientist, the doctors absolutely should be talking about the ways to prevent disease in terms of washing hands, all that kind of thing. But in terms of getting people back to work, unemployment going well past 20% in an instant, too, like an unemployment dragster, right? That's not the purview of doctors. That really is more the purview of the multifaceted, talented political scientists. So how do you take these? Look, this is a global problem. So what's like a multivariate cubed kind of, problem where you can pick one aspect of it and hyper focus on it. But really, this is going to be a thing that is not easily solved by twisting one knob.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. And I don't think it's just political scientists that have a role to play here. I mean, I think you're going to see governors and mayors having to act in, an active leadership role and make these decisions for their regions. I mean, obviously, there's an extraordinarily large place here for doctors and for epidemiologists. I mean, place for economists. But the point you made is an important point. There's more than one thing that has to be considered here. So when you watch the online debate about this, or even the debate around some scientific papers, a lot of people are acting as though the only thing to consider is how many people might die from COVID-19. And that's simply not realistic. Right. If considering basic social distancing and mitigation, which the IMHE model does, you have an upper bound of, say, 200,000 people that might die and a lower bound of 50,000 people that might die. But to get to the upper bound, you would have to keep people in their home, or to get to the lower bound, you'd have to keep people in their homes for, say, 6 months. I think that a realistic society might say, look, we're going to have to accept 100,000 deaths as opposed to 50,000 deaths. 3 million people die roughly every year. In order to keep the economy going, in order to prevent the food supply chain from collapsing, so on down the line. So I think it's the role of the doctor or the epidemiologist to come in there and say, look, these are my projections, and I, as a medical man, favor the lowest number of deaths possible. But then you also need an economist to come in with her saying, well, we also don't want Great Depression level unemployment. And the leader, the person that synthesizes those perspectives and makes a decision in real time, is going to have to decide what to do. And you're probably going to see a combination of things. I think one of the things that is often said about people that have sort of a quote unquote heterodox position on COVID-19 is, well, you want to go back to the beaches and the rave scene tomorrow. Not really. I mean, I think that the middle ground solution could be as simple as what you see in a Kroger or a Tesco. I mean, you've got spit shields between people. People are encouraged to give each other that 6 feet of politeness that we used to, at any rate, in an armed society. Wash your hands. I have a little bottle of hand sanitizer I carry with me. You know, cough in a respectful manner. This kind of thing. That would prevent a great percentage of the death that could accompany COVID-19. So no one's saying the options are either stay bottled up at your house all day or go out to an orgy. I mean, when you talk about some of the things that were going on in spring break a few weeks back, those aren't the options. The options are, do you wear a mask around your neck and put it on if you feel nervous? Do you sanitize your hands? Do you give people space? Do businesses have separate entrance and exit routes? There are a ton of things you could do to make this a great deal safer without eliminating everyone's job, I would say.
If Wil Reilly was president, that'd be a cool thing, I think. And, you know, the folks come to you and they say, you know, approximately whatever the number is, 3 million people die a year in the United States. This will, you know, potentially create deaths from a new way of dying to the tune of 100,000 people. But we don't know what the ultimate number will be. How many standard deviations away are we from like, wow, this is actually a problem the president needs to worry about? And I'm not talking about funding and provisioning. I'm talking about like making dramatic changes like cratering the entire economy or, you know, quarantining people to keep them safe. You know, these binary options. Like what? All deaths are tragic and we don't want anybody to die unnecessarily. So if that's the case, how does a president manage those? Is it one standard deviation away? Is it two before we start to go, holy shit, this thing really requires dramatic, different action?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think this is one of those that as we both get better known might be quoted dramatically out of context, like
I hope so.
Soldier and businessman, both of whom have assault rifles, talk callously about death. I mean, obviously you do want to take this extraordinarily seriously, but in all honesty, if I were in a presidential role and someone came to me and said, we're talking about a disease that over the course of a year might kill 100,000 individuals, will you shutter the economy? My response would be no. I would say that flatly, and I'm saying that from a leadership perspective rather than a medical perspective. And there are practical reasons for this. We tend to we're very removed from real life in the upper middle class in the United States. I've literally had my younger cousins, for example, ask some of those classic questions like, where does meat come from in the store? And at some point, you're going to have to take them out to kill it and demonstrate how that process begins. I think we have a similar opinion of money. I mean, we no longer use, quote unquote, the king's good coined gold. We have this paper money that's valuable because we believe it is. And then beyond that, all this funny money, you know, credit cards and checks with 2 or 3 names on the top and so on. So it's very tempting to say, well, why would we risk any lives? Why wouldn't we just print money and subsidize people for 6 months until the crisis is over? And the problem with that is that money is the consolidated sweat of our brow. That stuff still comes from somewhere. So, I mean, if we lose $10 trillion, I mean, one of the major investments of the US government and the business sector is in healthcare. If we accept the loss of $10 trillion, we're accepting the loss of $3 trillion toward Medicare, Medicaid, the private sector, money that would have gone directly to saving the lives of next year's patients in the Mayo Clinic. So if I were sitting behind the Resolute desk, and I think that would be a mistake for the country, but no more than a number of the ones we've made recently, if I were sitting behind the Resolute desk and someone came to me and said, we're talking about 100,000 potential deaths, will you shut down the economy? Absolutely not. I mean, we'd have to talk about how social distancing could best be practiced, that sort of thing. But in terms of how many standard deviations away from 100,000, that would depend on the confidence interval. But I mean, again, 2.8 to 3.1 million people die in a typical year. If someone just said a disease might kill 200,000 people, would you shutter the entire economy? Speaking personally, probably not. I think, again, we'd have to do very intense, well-done social distancing. There's very little sign from Sweden, or for that matter, Utah, that works significantly more poorly I and many others have written about this. But I think that, again, I want to emphasize the issue was that that's not what was presented to the president. What was presented to Mr. Trump and to our governors was this figure of 2.2 million people dying. And I don't think that unless they're trained quant methodologists, they were aware of what that meant. So, I mean, the original paper by Ferguson actually is not a panic-inducing document. I mean, what he says is you could cut his initial death figures in half just by doing very basic things like quarantining the sick. So that 2.2 million figure comes from a zone. I want to emphasize this because his work's been misinterpreted, comes from a situation where we don't do anything. That's a hypothetical that leads off the paper just to illustrate why leadership is important. So when the media started saying that and saying, well, we can have bodies in the street, that's not what anyone was seriously proposing. You know, at the most brutal level of utilitarianism, by the way, if you cut that in half and you get 1 million deaths, that's 1 in 350 people in the United States. I'm not advocating for that, but we are a huge society. During military engagements or even serious business projects like building a bridge, the kind of risks of loss that we were talking about in the worst case scenario are extremely common. And I think those sound terrifying to us just because that would be so many people because we've taken over a continent. But at any rate, that idea of millions dead was presented to our leaders. I won't say they panicked, but I will say there was a very intense reaction to it. And that was the source of that fear. No one gave the $100,000 final figure in the beginning. I would suspect that if you took the IMHE model with any reasonable current parameter, you estimate a 0.5% IFR, and this is to some extent guesswork, but I would assume that most of the estimates that I often describe this as the COVID-19 crisis and panic, because there certainly is a crisis. I mean, 100,000 deaths of countrymen, that's terrible, but there was the surrounding freakout. A guy named Thomas Pueo, who again, normally very solid stat, I believe it was 4 million people. I don't think it was 10. No, it was 10 million people. He estimated if we lose 4% of the pie, and that's what prompted this. That's what caused this. And that's also why so many general scientists said, well, wait, what are you basing that on, man?
On day one.
Different desk strategies.
Yes.
The upside of building your own desk would be that you could pose behind a replica of the Resolute desk looking a little tearful. That was weird. But anyway, I think I'd go with the classic desk.
The classic. Okay, good. Fair enough. I couldn't let the Resolute desk point go by without saying something about it. One of the questions that your article prompted when I posted it was, what about all of the lack of provisioning of medical supplies in general, right? Because we're trying to flatten the curve to give the hospitals and the supply chain a chance to catch up. And that supply chain problem goes throughout, like, toilet paper, all of these places. Our local Albertsons, like, we hired every truck driver we could find because, you know, now as a business, we've got this problem of this rush of people coming for very specific things. You know, they know how to run their or something else. All the restaurants that are now selling liquor, you know. So talk a little bit about that aspect of your article and how you consider that with.
Well, one of the things about flattening the curve that I want to emphasize right off the bat, the same number of people die in the curve flattening scenario. This elevated, more classically bell-shaped curve, and that's it. So the argument for curve flattening was never, we're going to save lives directly. The argument for curve flattening was that if we don't flatten the curve and everyone hits the hospitals at once, they could be swamped. But again, from COVID-19 that we've actually seen. Please, if anyone's listening, pretty high IQ audience, correct me if I'm making some incorrect assumptions. The argument for curve flattening was based on the assumption that if you've got an 80% infection rate and a 1% fatality rate and let's say a 5% ventilator use rate, hospitals are going to be absolutely full of people. But on the other hand, if you've got a 0.3% fatality rate and a 1.5% hospitalization rate and we mitigate significantly, that's not going to happen. So I don't pharmaceutical interventions to reduce COVID-19 mortality. People, whether they agree with perhaps my perspective, to delay the hospital overwhelming that was projected to occur. But kind of rambling here, if we only have a tenth as many sick and dead people, that hospital wrote a fairly well-known article about this. And some of these are large places. I mean, Nebraska, I didn't use it in the original analysis, talking about a situation where the medical system is facing the risk of being swamped. Then yeah, you might want to social distance very intensely or even consider a lockdown or do some of the things in terms of hiring backup people that you talked about. But the question is, again, these are empirical questions, is to me about their hospital closing. Many hospitals in order to sort of be team, they waited for this wave of COVID-19 patients. But in the huge majority of states, that never materialized. I mean, you've got a large number of states. Let me look at COVID deaths as of the last day I counted, because I'm redoing the spike piece with some slightly improved methods. I mean, deaths as of yesterday in a bunch of these states. I mean, New Hampshire, 81, Idaho, 63, Wyoming, 7. You know, some fairly good sized states here. Looks like Delaware, 159. Nebraska.
So to be fair, though, Wyoming has not even 1 million people in it, and it's enormous, especially if you drive through it.
Okay, well, New Mexico, 131. Good point, good correction. But Arkansas, 64. Oregon, 104. I mean, there's no way to downplay that one or for us to really debate that one. So, I mean, the question is, are we seeing the nightmare that was originally projected? And I don't see an honest way to say that we are. What we're seeing is about 65,000 deaths so far. This is something that's been going on for roughly 3 months. Very intense now, a month and a week, month and 2 weeks. So that is horrible. I mean, that is nearly the death toll that we'll see for opiates this year. It's a significant killer. It'll be top 5, most likely. But I don't necessarily think that the original predictions that led to flattening the curve were borne out.
Yeah, that's a fair comment. In your article, also, you talked about not using Asian country data for some reason. You pulled that out. Can you talk about that briefly?
Sure. Well, in the article, I do mention the Asian countries. What I say is that, so first, I look at the U.S. states that opted never to shut down, by which I mean formally entering shelter-in-place order. And like I said, there are a bunch of them. I mean, you've got both Dakotas. You do have some small states like Wyoming, but you've also got Utah. You've got Nebraska. You've got Iowa. You could throw Oklahoma in that mix. You could throw South Carolina in that mix. I mean, they did issue a sort of order eventually, but this took until April the 6th, and it allowed religious services and some other things. But I look at those states, and I find that on average, there are not more cases of COVID-19 in states that never shut down, and there are not more deaths from COVID-19 in states that never shut down. If you look at COVID-19 cases per million, so this is with population fully adjusted for, in the social distancing states, you've got 729 on average when I did this first analysis. If you look at deaths per million in the social distancing states, you've got 12. Now, if you look at the non-social distancing states where you had a full lockdown, you had on average 1,392 just cases per million, and you had 54 deaths per million. So, I mean, to the extent that that's significant at all, the advantage would be in favor of the non-lockdown social distancing states. So in the paper, I then go over to Sweden and I say, well, you know, Sweden might not be performing exactly as well as its Nordic neighbors, although it was very close, in fact. Sweden had 1,309 definite tested confirmed cases per million people. If I recall correctly, Denmark had 1,274 and Norway had 1,221.
Come on.
There wasn't a big difference really at all, but perhaps a slight advantage for lockdowns in that case as versus the reverse in the USA.
But I mean, really, that's not statistically significant. I mean, that could be someone had an orgy or something.
Yeah, no, it's not. I was just sort of steel manning the other side's case. I mean, what I saw, frankly, is that there was very little difference, if any, between lockdown states and social distancing states if you adjust for basic things like population. That's why the article got published. I mean, there was very little difference there. What difference there was advantaged the social distancing non-lockdown states. And there might be a parallel to dieting there. I mean, you can stay 6 feet away from people. You can wash your hands, so on, pretty much indefinitely. How long can you stay in your house without then binging and rushing to Walmart with 1,000 other people or playing 5-on-5 basketball in the park or doing the things you've seen people do in those lockdown states? That's just speculation. But I mean, I definitely didn't see a massive advantage for lockdowns. The question you asked was about Asia, though. I do mention the Asian countries because a lot of them didn't lock down. I mean, you had Japan, you had SK, South Korea. One of the city states, I believe I looked at Singapore, not Hong Kong. All of them had very low case and death rates as well, easily on par with the rest of the world or better. The reason I didn't directly throw them into the analysis with the kind of regression techniques that were used and so on is that I do think it's not a fair comparison. I mean, it would make my point, but there are extreme cultural differences there. I mean, are you going to see the same level of obedience to an order to, treat others with respect or something in New Jersey that you would in South Korea? And secondarily, they did extremely good testing and tracing up front. If you look at some of those Asian powers like South Korea, I don't really know how respectful of civil rights they were in the beginning. I mean, they went around to everyone that had been infected in, for example, a church. They essentially interrogated them. They found everyone they'd been in contact with. They tested all those people. They set up drive-through testing stations in infected cities. And you kind of get the impression that they were walking guys into them. It wasn't, you could say yes or you could say no. And they found most of their cases early on. You've seen a couple secondary surges, but they did wrap that up. And that's why for a very long time, South Korea was the only country reporting what turned out to be about the actual IFR for COVID-19. I believe they added some seniors later on that boosted this number, but for a long time, their CFR, actually, their tested death rate was 0.5 or 0.6, as versus, 2, 3, and so on. But the Asian countries did a much better job of wrapping that up early on. And that's why I don't directly compare them to New York, for example.
A friend of mine, Peter Van Buren, he lives in New York City, and he was talking to a number of hospital folks, especially like the hasty hospitals. And listen, this is something that we're good at doing. We can throw a hospital up in hours. This is like the government can do this really fast. But each empty bed is a point of inefficiency. So do you think when this is all said and done that we'll look at the president's response and say, not that it wasn't enough, but that it was too much response, and that, we have to make the Mercy and the Hope and these other hospital ships show up somewhere? That's billions of dollars of activity that largely was wasted. So do you think that as we look at this and the quants go through and look at things, we'll see that the response actually was too much?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think so. The question that's going to be discussed by political scientists and epidemiologists, I mean, psychiatrists to some extent, when we look at the mental health impacts of this, economists, for a while is, given what we knew was a bad decision made. Now I've made some comments about what you and I would do if as, local leader types, we were actually president sitting there with the big desk. If someone came to me and the projection was 100,000, no, you're not shutting down the economy. Hopefully it doesn't sound harsh to say that, but I don't think a competent leader would do that. But if someone came to me and the projection was 3 million, yeah, maybe. I mean, if you're talking about that original WHO estimate, like a pathogen with a 4% fatality rate is nothing to mess around with.
Right.
I mean, what would the secondary fatality rates there be? I mean, as you talk about just ordinary civilian citizens, armed. No, I didn't read some of these papers until days later. I'm just a guy. I have the luxury of sitting on an ass thinking. That's my job. So I could read this stuff and say, hey, this doesn't make a lot of sense, and make mathematical notes. But I mean, so the real question is, should someone have read through, say, Ferguson's paper and asked, hey, how did this guy estimate an 80% infection rate? I'm not saying he was, but are people just making this stuff up? And I've wondered that myself when I look at some of the things like the IMHE model. Like, right now we've got about 65,000 dead. The IMHE model, well-designed model, but until a couple days ago was predicting a total of like 62,000 dead, right? And the other day they tweaked it and they were like, nope, 78. I mean, I think that there should have been more questions asked, like, where are you getting these numbers? Is this one province in southern China? Are you believing their government's data? Why aren't we? One question that I do think should have been asked weeks ago is, why aren't we doing more random sero testing? Why did that come down to a private group of dissident, I think center right, could be wrong, academics from Stanford? I mean, why wasn't the government doing this large scale? Why weren't we buying tons of tests from Decode so we would know this stuff? We could have been shut down for a week while we were dealing with, the worst case scenario. Then we would have been aware of what was going on. But in terms of just the reaction, I guess what I'm saying is I don't think the reaction was all that unreasonable. I would have wished for more in-depth reading of the papers. And I think if Trump had some elite quants on his staff at the top levels, that might have happened. I mean, you keep seeing things like Jared Kushner's in charge of this or that initiative. It reminds me of when Bush was having these guys that had just gotten out of elite Christian colleges run whole cities in Iraq. And I'm not sure how good a job they did. But anyway, you could wish for more reading of the papers. You could wish for more serological testing. I think if someone tells you 3 million people are going to die, some overreaction is understandable.
Yeah. And also, who wants to be the person who has to stand up and give those briefings every night and make the call? I mean, that's a hard job, whether it's Gavin Newsom, Cuomo, any governor, any major city mayor. It's not an easy job because you need people like Jared Kushner to be next to you because you trust his judgment and his ability to go out and get you answers. But also, you need experts who aren't full of shit. And look, you can't. I talked to early on. I talked to an infectious disease professor here at a local, very well-known university, and that person said this would be like a nasty flu, most likely. He put the caveat in there, like, we'll see, but protect young kids, protect old people, and ride this thing out was his initial immediate response. And that's proven to be, other than the young kids, that's proven to be relatively accurate because it turns out that's what he does for a living. But you cannot find agreement with that outside of his profession. People have lost their minds in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, this seems to be something where, so there's a lot here. I mean, a one sentence way to put it is that American society is getting softer. So most people have no face-to-face experience with death or with serious competition. And if you read about this, like the traditional sort of initiations into manhood or womanhood have almost disappeared. So I read recently that a smaller number of men than ever before are competitive varsity athletes through high school, and then a smaller number of men than ever before go into the military, which used to be mandatory. And I would suspect that you could probably add to that a smaller number of women than ever before have a child, late teens, early 20s, which is itself a pretty graphic process. I mean, it's not just you hugging the baby at the end, if you've ever been there for that. I would suspect the same thing, violent physical fighting, anything, even going out into business on your own. People aren't doing that to the extent that they used to. I mean, one of the provisions of Obamacare that's just widely applauded is that you can stay on your mom and dad's health insurance until you're 27, through your 26th year, as I understand. So I think when you took people that have been raised in this society and said something that throughout most of history probably would not have been all that surprising, which is, less than 1% of the population might die through an entire year, the reaction was sort of an extraordinary panic rather than just people calmly saying all men die. The sort of things that happened in the past. It's worth noting that if you look at those societies, Sparta, Rome, the Han Chinese, the Manchu, certainly something like the Mongols, who are barely civilized. I mean, plagues would sweep through any good-sized town every couple of years and kill 2 to 5% of the population. So we simply haven't had an experience with that. Most of us are not warriors in the actual sense. Most of us aren't even trained athletes in the actual sense. Most of us have not owned a business and done something like produce shoes, starting with a horse skin. So this thing that's occurred throughout history, just the idea of plague, was absolutely terrifying to us. And it produced the response that we saw. I think can you repeat your question, by the way? I think I got a little off track there. I think what I said is true.
What the heck was my question? What my question was is if you and I were to play 5-on-5 basketball back in my basketball playing days and we were governors. Let me one of the critiques of your paper that we got online too, and I want to make sure we address this before we get too far away, is defining terms of lockdown versus quarantine versus nothing. How much did that play into your analysis?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm thinking about writing with a guy named Dr. Steinmetz, medical background himself. I'm thinking about writing a serious journal piece on this. I've actually been in contact with another academic, Christos Makridis, and we might write something related. I mean, I do teach at a state U. I'm interested in academic publication. I've talked to people that are at least as good as I am with stats or with understanding of these concepts. So if we did that, if something went into, say, JAMA, for example, to shoot high, I mean, you'd absolutely have to define, say, 6 different types of interdiction used by countries. For this article, I use a fairly simple definition of shutdown, and that is, does the state have a shelter-in-place order in existence that mandates 10 or 12 specific things? There's a legal definition of that. If you didn't, you're not shut down. I mean, certainly in a social distancing scenario, You can tell people not to be morons or jackasses. There's nothing against the rules there. I mean, you can cancel minor league baseball games. But I mean, if you go to Iowa, I mean, I would suspect most restaurants are open. And if they're not, you can come in, talk to a person, then get curbside service. I mean, there are in South Dakota, the majority of businesses are open. Bars even have remained open, but it's going to be enforced that you stay a certain distance from someone. There's going to be a focus on people being in the patio, this kind of thing. I mean, that's not a shutdown. That's the alternative. I want to emphasize that nobody who is in that general scientific, quote unquote, heterodox community, but who's not an idiot, is saying we need to immediately go back to indoor raves. People who do that, because that's really no more risky than a Tinder date when you think about it, except perhaps the number of individuals. People who do that are taking an individual personal risk, and you can debate whether it is something they have a right to do. But I don't think that the government, for example, should be sponsoring large county fairs or something like that. Social distancing implies staying at a distance. It implies cleaning yourself. It implies being polite to others. But that is in no way a shutdown. So I just defined a shutdown as shelter-in-place order in the state, mandating that businesses shut down. If you wanted to go into more detail, I mean, there's several different levels. Whether or not you favor opening party venues and retail stores, I don't personally see much reason, now that we've worked out how to use some of this protective tech, this PPE, that factories can't be open. I think that this decision to close the supply chain was just that, a decision to some extent. I think that that's reversible. But I used a simple definition for the short form article of lockdown or shutdown. That was just an SIP order, a formal SIP.
Charles Bartlett brings up a point of the Trump administration spent all of January and February downplaying the virus, and instead of mobilizing COVID testing programs.
So did everybody else. Now that's a fair point, by the way. I think I've bantered with Mr. Bartlett online. It's not an idiotic point. I'm not a huge. I don't have a MAGA hat on right now, you know. But I mean, when people say this about Donald Trump, like Donald Trump absolutely did not take this virus seriously enough. That orange, you know, blah blah blah. You have to put this in context. I mean, Mayor Bill de Blasio on March the 5th encouraged people to go out to the movies in New York City's public theaters and was recommending movies for people to see and bantering online. And he's a funny guy, apparently, bantering online with people about these movies, like, oh, like an old school karate film kind of thing. Not a direct de Blasio quote. But I mean, nobody expected. You saw a very rapid transition. Nobody expected the initial projections for COVID, I think is how I would put that. So there were probably people that would have predicted what we actually saw, i.e. 60,000 individuals sick that have died so far, so on. But the expectation leading into COVID-19 from almost everyone was that this would be the equivalent of a very bad flu season, and this is not a nation of cowards. We shouldn't panic too much. And you actually saw versions of this attitude around the world. I mean, Italy actually had a semi-serious holiday called Hug a Chinese Traveler Day. I don't think that aged extraordinarily well, but you have all these pictures of people in Lombardy and so on hugging Chinese guests and visitors and guest workers. And we did the same thing here in the United States. I mean, Joe Biden has a number of quotes along these lines, like, no, I wouldn't close the border. I think that's a subtle form of racism, if I have that correct. Nancy Pelosi said very similar things. People were accusing Trump of being xenophobic for trying to stop some of our kind of commercial intercourse with China. This is undisputed. This is part of the record. So just to single out Trump and say, well, Trump didn't take this seriously, I think is partisanship. Nobody took this seriously because one of the biggest secrets you can learn in life is that you never expect the serious, bad, or even good things that happen. I mean, a talented military opponent is not going to announce their strike before they attack Pearl Harbor. I mean, a plague, that's usually something that gets loose from a lab or a newly discovered species or something like that. You don't know about it before it hits. That's why it's a plague. You don't have time to set up protective barriers, get your PPE in place. And what we saw here was a pretty typical fractal, unexpected event that you're going to encounter in a leadership role. I don't think Trump handled it any worse than Pelosi, any worse than Biden. I mean, remember where we were just a month and a half ago. There were, up to Super Tuesday, you had how many Democratic candidates? 9?
Yeah.
I mean, there was no unified front on COVID-19. I mean, candidates were accusing each other of not having international experience, of having pretended to be Native American. It was just the usual nonsense. So I don't think Trump did especially badly. I think, in fact, if Trump had stopped all commercial exchange with China when we found out about this, he would have been branded a total brutal racist. If we had escaped any harm from COVID-19 because of that, it wouldn't have been recognized, except maybe in comparison with other countries. And it would be used as a talking point against Trump in the election. Racist stops our exchange with the Chinese, our beautiful ally. But anyway, so there are three stages to the COVID-19 conversation. First stage, which may have been right, was just wash your hands, don't be a jackass. Second stage was post-Ferguson. You can talk about PF and BF, kind of like AD and BC. Ferguson said 2.2 million, planet shut down. Then gradually, as the methods community began to vet through that and other epidemiologists began to come out and so on, you sort of saw stage 3 where people are saying, okay, 70,000 people might die, and again, wash your hands. But nobody expected that kind of fractal projection with the huge lump here.
When we look at the COVID's ugly cousin, or better, somehow we made the flu an attractive thing nowadays. I don't know what happened, but we, as a nation, we don't rush to the store to get flu shots. We don't practice constant hygiene. I've seen videos of how to wash your hands, all of these things. And the flu is reaping every year.
Yep.
We'll say at the low, on average, 35,000 people, right? And spiking to twice that, sometimes a little more. We didn't act differently at all during these times. And I know the flu and COVID are not the same, but they're akin in terms of numbers and that kind of thing. And I want to add in another point I want you to get into afterwards, but It's also targeting very specific age groups and affirmity. You know, like a bunch of young guys in the park playing basketball. Guess what? Probably, I'm not a numbers guy, but when I look at the numbers and the age groups, it's like a 20,000% that those guys are going to die.
Yeah, no, I will say, I mean, I've been asked to play some 5-on-5. I believe we both played a fair amount of basketball in life. And I mean, I say no because the question is, if I do something like volunteer to help out a senior neighbor, is there a chance of getting them sick? That's the real question. But so you're asking about what are the demographic breakdowns for COVID?
Yeah, but also just like our treatment of the flu in general, you know, somehow it's become this no big thing. It still kills 40,000 people a year or so, and sometimes twice that. But we don't get flu shots. We don't wash our hands properly. You know, we avoid all of these things, but somehow COVID, this is that pandemic versus panic, you know, toggle switch.
Yeah, I mean, so I think this again gets back into I get very annoyed when people say, you know, nothing is worth a human life, this sort of thing, because that's simply not realistic. Human beings are a predator species. America's, at least traditionally, although we discuss whether this is still true, been a warrior society. All people will die. The defining fact of life, which probably explains a great deal of the religious experience, is that you are going to die, probably in an unpleasant way. So in general, he says cheerfully, but I mean, it's just a fact of life. But I mean, so in general, we have not dramatically changed our society in response to potential mortality level threats. You're absolutely right. And by the way, after looking at some of the stuff about how simple this is, like I have the hand sanitizer in my back pocket, I probably would be a little cleaner. And they do this in Asian countries. You know, the masks are perfectly acceptable during flu season. I think we'll stop laughing at that. To the extent we did, but it's generally been a point of fun here. You know, I'm not going to walk around like that. Anyway, whether or not a little more mitigation is useful, you're absolutely right that 40 to 50,000 people die every flu season. We don't lock up the country because we can't. We know the flu's coming back every year. We don't have the luxury of a 3-month break. And the same thing's true of virtually everything. I mean, Heather McDonald, commenting on this whole situation, pointed out that you could save probably 50,000 lives a year by lowering the speed limit to 25 miles an hour. I mean, there are 45,000 to, at the upper end, going back a couple decades, 70,000 car crashes every year. The huge majority of those are fatal crashes. The huge majority of those would be non-fatal if you're just going 20 miles an hour. And that's still the pace of a fast horse or a bicycle. You could get to 90% of your appointments just fine. Why don't we do that? Because it would be an extraordinary pain in the ass. There'd
just
be
like if you mandated exercise, instead of keeping people off the beach, like you will march 10 miles a day up and down the beach. Hey, a lot less people are going to die.
Absolutely. You simply ban all forms of tobacco and e-tobacco. I mean, 500,000 saved tomorrow. We don't do that because we're not a dictatorship. That's the one sentence answer, and this is where the political scientists and the former military and espionage guys and the psychologists really do have a role to play by saying, well, look, there's more here than just a simple question of lives and mortality. Things other than life have value. I was talking once during the gun control debate a couple years back when Marco Rubio was being hauled into CNN and unfairly pilloried and all that. And a friend said, well, I know you like your guns and you're a good shot and you teach people how to use weapons and so forth. But, what that you do with your guns is worth the life of even one human being. And I just thought about it. My response was, well, me and 10 million other people hunting with our sons or daughters. I mean, it's like that's a thing that has value. If you banned firearms, that experience of going out for deer season with everyone in your family, gone. That experience of going to the range, gone. The ability to shoot a rapist in your house, gone. None of these things directly relate to life or death. I mean, even if someone is assaulting your wife, they're probably not going to kill you or her, but it's something you'd probably want to prevent, right? I mean, so there obviously are levels of valuation that go far beyond simply money on the bank hid for a life. And one of those analyses comes into play when it comes to our response to the flu. We just sort of stand up to the flu, we get a shot, and we go out in the world. And you're absolutely right. This goes well beyond even infectious diseases. I mean, the biggest killers in the United States are cancer, heart disease caused by obesity, tobacco, smoking. You'd have to put unsafe sex in the top 10. I mean, we've almost forgotten about AIDS. AIDS is still a killer. So, I mean, if you can have Tinder in the era of HIV, I don't necessarily see that the level of reaction we engaged in here was logical.
And then what about the age group part of it?
Oh yeah,
it's a whole lot of folks that should be working, aren't working because of the. It's just like we're not looking again multivariate, right? Like we have different age group, you have different demos. It's a shame to keep a lot of good working folks out of work and then imperiling their financial future, which ultimately could be their lives.
Yep. Yeah, and again, this all has to be taken into account. I mean, so to answer your question directly, because obviously I can go on for a while with some of this stuff. One of the things that I think people have been very dishonest about with COVID-19, one of them is that we now know the actual CFR and IFR to some very real extent. I haven't seen a lot of papers modify the initial doomsday claims from a month ago, or mention that flattening the curve may well not be necessary if we've got a 0.2% IFR. That's one of them. Another thing that people seem to be almost intentionally dishonest about is that COVID-19 is an extraordinarily age-specific threat. I was looking through some data that Jane Lingle, my partner, sent me, and it was put together by some kind of center-right media organization, but you can vet it against New York City data. It's absolutely accurate. You talked about this with me on Facebook, and we confirmed that it was correct, as I recall. In the busiest day for deaths in New York City, the number of people, or one of the busiest days by now, the number of people under 65 with none of a group of very serious pre-existing conditions that died was 11.
11.
Well, 11, yes. And I believe the total was something like 1,860. So the reality of COVID-19 is that when people say things like this virus doesn't care who you are, that's absolutely non-accurate. If you go with any accepted data, even the WHO data from China early on when they at least had a presence in the country, certainly the US CDC age group data, your chance of dying of COVID-19 as a healthy person under 50, if you get COVID-19, seems to be between 1 in 400 at the high end and 1 in 1,000. So that is the reality. In Italy, they actually broke down who the average victim was. And it turned out to be an 81-year-old person with multiple pre-existing conditions. Average age was 81. I think that's a mean average. And 99% of those that died had at least one pre-existing condition. They just did this in Britain. I saw the Sky News release about it. 95% of Brits, age range wasn't that much different, and 95% had serious pre-existing conditions. So, I mean, that is who's at risk. you can say that COVID-19 is worse for those demographic groups than the flu, and we absolutely need to acknowledge and recognize that. But the huge majority of people aren't in those demographic groups. We can talk about what serious PEC means and so on, but I mean, the biggest risk predictor seems to be being over 65. That is a fact.
Yeah, if we allow it to be a fact. I mean, we can't stand it, and it becomes a political argument really fast. One other thing I wanted to ask you about, just because I know you have a good answer, the balance between defending our rights versus defending our collective lives. We have demonstrations going on, sometimes armed demonstrations going on. We have the right to do that, but do we have the right to jeopardize one another with more COVID exposure?
I think that's a fascinating question. I mean, to some extent, the constitutional answer would be yes, but I discourage it. So this gets into the difference between social shaming and dictatorship. Like I said, if one of my boys asked me, do you want to play 5-on-5 basketball? I would say no, and I don't really think you should either. Your girl is pregnant or you live with your grandmother. I mean, they're going to be, the kids are going back to school pretty soon. Think about this. Give it another week. That is social pressure, and as a result of that, you don't see large parties going on during this situation, even in rural Kentucky areas where the police are not almost certainly going to crack down, maybe aren't going to find that location. Social sanction from the government is something a little different. Can the government tell you legally not to leave your house? I'm genuinely curious. I'm actually going to look up some precedent cases today. My offhand impression would be no. Generally, we have recognized that the government does have significant emergency powers. During the quote-unquote Great Influenza 1918, 1919, I mean, there were cities that mandated that people wear masks. There were cities that canceled things like pro baseball games. Whether it was legal or not, nobody made a huge deal about it. I would venture to say that's over on the acceptable side of legality. What we're seeing now, though, is a lot of writers on the right and center have pointed out, not a quarantine. A quarantine is when you lock up sick people. And quarantines are allowed by law. What we're doing now is locking up healthy people who have a perhaps 1 in 1,000 chance of having active COVID-19. Whether you can do that is very questionable. From the reading I've done, I don't think this has happened until now. And this seems to be, when I said we're getting a little softer, this seems to be the extension of something we've seen throughout society. So traditionally, the idea was that if you had a problem, you might get frankly teased about it, and it was your duty to deal with it. If you were overweight, the guys on the team were going to hassle you a little bit, and you were going to eat some turkey sandwiches until you lost weight. I'm not saying I approve of this, but that is what would happen. Now we're seeing the movement against fat shaming, where all of society is expected to acknowledge that you have a perfect right to be somewhat obese, even in situations like coach class airline seats. That's a change. And you're seeing this across the line, quote unquote, slut shaming. The idea of the rotating pronouns and so on in the transgender context. If you define that your gender identity is changing, it's not your duty to tell people that, or even to say something like, I'm feeling kind of butch today. It's other people's duty to ask you your preferred pronouns and title of address and so on. And in a much more serious version, we're seeing this here. The idea with the COVID quarantines is essentially that if COVID-19 is very dangerous to specific sick older people, they should not stay home. Everyone should stay home, because otherwise it would be an infringement on their civil rights to keep them in the house. And whether you approve or disapprove of that, that is a new thing under the yellow sun. I mean, traditionally in the past, I think that what would have happened, I know what would have happened, is that seniors would have been encouraged to stay home, very strongly encouraged in many cities, and some kind of collective action network would have been set up to bring them food with gloves on. Now that we seem less willing to do that, the idea is that everyone should remain in the house until the threat to the seniors has passed.
The last thing I want to bring up is, when do you take your foot off of the accelerator? This was going to be a 2-week incubation thing. We're just going to chill out. We're going to flatten the curve. And it's like 2 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. It seems like we're afraid to say, okay, let's start going back to normal life. I know we're in the process of doing it, but that doesn't mean this isn't a complicated, scary, confusing time.
First of all, I think that there's a difference between normal people and the weirdos that spend all day on social media and get quoted on cable news. I mean, just living in a mid-sized Kentucky city, if I talk to my boy and ask when they open up, are you going to be back in the dealership so I can come by and buy a truck? He's going to say, yeah. I mean, what I'm probably going to do is, and this is just a gesture of politeness to others, but probably take a basic mask and wear that around my neck. And if I'm in an area where I see people, sure, I'll tuck that over my face. It makes them slightly more safe. It makes people that are nervous feel better. That's fine. The odds of me not going to the gym, the range, maybe the dojo, I'm fat and out of shape, haven't been there in a long time. But I mean, the store to get some food, the general steps you'd make as an adult individual is zero. I mean, one thing I will say, a lot of people have really overhyped what quarantine means now. So the rules of most shelter-in-place orders, Kentucky doesn't even have a formal shelter-in-place. You have a healthy at home, but are things like be very careful around seniors, don't gather in groups of more than 10, try to limit your travel to essentials, the store, and so on, get some exercise. So, I mean, every couple of days, a normal person would be going to the market for a couple of hours or would be going out for a 3-hour run. So these people that are kind of lurking inside their houses, watching through the blinds and calling the cops on people walking their dogs aren't really doing any good. It's a weird, anti-French resistance kind of snitching. And I think that the average person is going to be pretty happy to get back to normal life. The other thing, I don't want to keep emphasizing this. We're not trying to pit the quote-unquote heartland against New York or anything obnoxious. But you've got to understand it, and you do. In a lot of these states, there's very little risk. If you're looking at death or what you could describe as critical cases, Utah, 46 COVID deaths. That's not only a big state, multiple millions of people, Salt Lake City. That's also, for most of the state, one of the non-lockdown states. So if you've got 50 deaths in your whole state, even those measures you are taking, you might begin to ask, why don't we just wear masks and give each other a little space? Even if you go to the top 10 or 20 states, you're talking about Virginia, 581, Colorado, 820. This is the whole state. North Carolina, big state, 419. So I don't think most people are going to be so cowed by the prospect of 400 deaths and perhaps 4 times that many critical cases that they're going to remain locked in their homes. I think that's something that the media is, for whatever reason, encouraging. And
go ahead.
Sorry.
The other thing I was going to say was if you compare Utah's population 3 point less than 5, and you compare it to where I live, Orange County, 3 point less than 5. On any given day, there's 3.5 million people in either state, right?
Yeah.
50 deaths in both places. One is exceptionally denser, and one is a lot more spaced out. 50 deaths. And they're trying to not let us go to the beach here. This is what we do. This is why we live here,
That's idiotic. I rarely would give such a blunt critique of state policy, but the idea that you shouldn't be out in the sun 6 feet from other people is the dumbest thing.
Yeah, it's a whole lot of beach.
I think that there's who's the old British king that stood in the ocean and told the water to go back because the people didn't deserve it or whatever, King Canute. It's a lot of this kind of crap. If there's an old line from one of Hitler's marshals, the average man's gait is a goose step. And what that means is that many people are, in intimate terms, let's say subs. Many people like to be told what to do. They like to be able to look at the face of a commanding leader. In leadership situations, I've learned that one of the most effective things you can do is just look very calm and laugh sometimes. And people like this idea. Someone knows what they're doing. Hey, the boss, this $10 million deal probably won't fail, leaving us all homeless. Whatever. It's people like someone to make that confident projection of authority. And the people that like to make that confident projection of authority often have some jackass potential and go way, way overboard with it if they're not held in check by other free citizens. And I think that this is one of the things that we're seeing with these governor's proclamations. Jesus. One of them that Jane read to me was, you can go horseback riding, but only alone. If you have a second person with you, they can't be in the same train of horses. They can't have the same remount horse.
Who thought that up? Almost by default, you're 6 feet away from someone if they're on a horse.
How
A
big
horse
is
is
a horse? 12
three and a half feet wide almost by the time your legs are on there and everything.
Yeah, it's just silly. But I mean, it's that kind of thing, I think, is so. First of all, I don't think that there's been a dramatic difference in deaths between OC and Utah. And I do think that the overreach of presidential and gubernatorial power is a serious problem. The scariest thing about COVID-19 to me is not the disease, although I'm perfectly respectful of the disease.
Of course.
It is the realization that in response to a potential loss of 100,000 lives, most Americans willingly gave up virtually all of their civil rights. I mean, for a month, people agreed to be confined to their homes. I think we were pretty good about it during the first week of this before a lot of data came in. But the question is, could this happen again? Will this happen in the climate change debate, for example, where people will say, you know, there's a projection from the Imperial College or the University of Michigan that this many people could die if we don't do this. Now, we need to do it now. Will people simply accede to that and later find out that it perhaps wasn't necessary? You know, what are the threats that kill more than 100,000 people per year? I mean, you could argue racism, probably.
Yeah.
Guns over certainly a 2-year period. Opiates. I mean, in response to any of these things, will we be told that it's time to jump on board with, you know, Team Kentucky or whatever? Not make fun of my state, but, you know, USA quarantine, and, you know, again, sacrifice some liberties from some security. When it comes to sacrificing any liberties for security, I'm pretty much with Ben Franklin. It's not a wise thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the thing is because of our self-selection to this country and how we all got here, for the most part, you know, we're not going to take it. We're going to be like, okay, great. You know, we gave you this one. You guys overplayed your hand. Next time, I'm going to go out and work on my crossover because I got to get by people. You know, my drop step isn't getting any better by not practicing it. I'm going to be in the park. You know, people are just. It's like when they tell South Floridians to evacuate from their homes during a hurricane. What? Or South Louisiana. They know what to do. They're already prepared. They're not going to leave because most of the time the hurricane doesn't come. And when it does, they need to be there to take care of their shit, you know?
Yeah, and the flip side of that is that every so often there is Katrina, and not only are there losses, that also then becomes the rallying cry for why you need to give up your power to the government. Everyone forgets the 80 hurricanes that never made landfall, and they all remember the people standing on the roofs, you know, waving pleadingly at helicopters. Even then, I mean, I'm not at all going to comment. I don't know all the details.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would suspect, in fact, I know numerically, there have to have been a pretty significant number of people that when the water receded just walked north out of New Orleans and got away from Katrina. That's, I mean, you essentially get up into the high ground away from Pontchartrain within a day.
Yeah.
But that, again, is rarely the story that's focused on. It's the very small number of people that were in genuinely helpless situations down where the levees broke near the projects. This is why you need to obey the big man. And there's certain things you just can't say in America. Like, if you make that choice and miscalculate, well, then you're going to die. That would be absolutely unacceptable to say that people can make that choice of their own free will. And if they do, there might not be as much of an intense attempt to save them. That's not necessarily even something immoral, but it's something that would be greeted with insane screeching in the USA.
There were that year, 2006, and I'm on memory here, so I don't know the actual number, but there were something like 8 hurricanes that made landfall in Florida the same year. And so the same FEMA that couldn't handle it in New Orleans handled it very well in Florida, too. That's the other thing. It's like you look at the government and you can expect them to give you help that you might not otherwise get sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And anything more than that is unrealistic expectation, you know?
Yeah, and so this gets into... And by the way, obviously, when I'm talking about New Orleans, I'm not saying we should abandon people who are in the path of disasters or something.
Of course.
But I do think that people have the right to choose to risk death to some extent. If I was a homeowner in Cajun country in Louisiana and I was told that a hurricane was coming, I would at least consider just staying in the house, essentially fortifying that. Many of these are built on concrete pads with storm basements. Waiting it out, seeing if it came at all. But the catch is, if I made that decision, I wouldn't necessarily expect the government to expend millions of dollars coming to get me. I would hope my hunting skills were on point until things return to normal. But I think people have the right to make that decision and to inform local authorities of that. I mean, in the case of COVID-19, at the most basic level, once we've got, our beloved seniors protected, once we've educated people on social distancing, if adult fighting age men and women want to go back to work and open up the body shop, and they say, look, I don't necessarily need ventilator level care if I get sick. I'm willing to take this risk. I know you might not have one for me, but I think I can survive the disease, and I know you'll do your best. I don't see an ethical way to keep that person in their house. I really don't. I mean, I don't see that an adult armed citizen can't make that choice. And that's what people mean by the nanny state. I mean, so it's perfectly fine for the state to say, well, if you do this, you're going to die, which is a lie in this case, but you'll be taking a 1 in 1,000 risk of death, and it's a dangerous, scary disease. But if someone then says, okay, I've taken many serious risks in my life, spent a lot of time in the third world, most of my relatives are dead, I'll risk death in exchange for all this money. I don't see how you can then tell them, no, you won't. And that's that second step that we're now seeing.
Yeah.
And this, again, sweeps throughout society. I mean, there are mass movements against bullying and fist fighting in high school. I mean, there are mass movements against military recruitment in high school and even college. I mean, there are serious proposals to lower the speed limit to 55 again. What is it? The mayor of one of the major, it was New York. And actually, I don't even dislike this guy. It was Bloomberg. But I mean, banned soda pop. You can only get a 16-ounce soda because otherwise you were risking your life. You don't need the mayor to tell you if you're out on a date that you can't get the 32-ounce before you go into the movie. I mean, these are not decisions government needs to be making. If your date thinks you're a little fat, she'll tell you. I mean, we don't need this sort of constant invasive government presence. But I think that's what separates COVID-19, and I'm sure we'll talk about a few other things, but end of this thread for me. What separates COVID-19 from threats in the past isn't that it's much worse. No one would rank COVID-19 ahead of the Spanish flu. I wouldn't rank it ahead of the 57, 58 Asian flu. It does fall ahead of SARS, but remember what a threat that was. We were very lucky to stop it at around 20,000 plus the flu season plus pneumonia. The difference now between those three real cases I just detailed in COVID-19 to a large extent is the prevalence of this constant outrage media, where you have people on Twitter all day tweeting at the president with stories about deaths in their town. I mean, where you have the media that's a 24-hour cycle. Could we win a war in this environment? I don't know. We did, but that's to the credit of our troops, remarkably. And even then, you guys had to kind of cheat with the media. I mean, these embedded reporters, I don't think were getting to talk quite as much as they wanted. It would have been very difficult to have Vietnam-level coverage of something like the Battle of Fallujah.
Speaking of combat things, too, you have to understand like the individual perspective of things. If you tell me that there's a risk to my life, I've been hit by a tank. I've had bullets whiz by my ear where I thought, wow, that should have hit me, So you tell me that I'm going to get exposed to some kind of virus that's going to kill me. Hey, great. You know what? Something's going to get me. Like my level of regard for my longevity is appropriate for a guy that wants to stay alive and middle-aged. But if it's my time, it's my time. What am I going to do? I have not 9 lives. It must be 29 lives because there's so many things that have happened. I had a rocket bounce down the road next to me that just didn't happen to have explosives in it. You're trying to tell me that the flu is going to get me? Great. Okay. I'm wondering what it's going to be. I'm not unkillable. I'm just saying that my level of panic about dying, it's like 1.
Yeah. No, I tend to agree. I haven't had those military experiences, which, by the way, I greatly respect. Thank you for your service and all the positive things people say. I mean them. But I mean, when I grew up in 2 murder capitals. I mean, I was born on the south side of Chicago. Grew up mostly on the north side. But when I finally ended up moving to the suburbs, I moved to the east side of Aurora because my mom was an inner city school teacher. Again, great job, I respect, but we lived where she taught. And for the next 2 years after I moved there, I thought I was going to the suburbs. That was the most violent city in the USA. We had about 100,000 people at the time. One year, I think we had 39 murders. The next year, we beat that. Jesus. A kid I knew casually was in a hotel room when members of a rival gang ran in and shot everybody in the room and the girls they were with. And these are just high school age guys. So this was being discussed on campus the next day. I was sitting on our track once getting ready for practice, and we started hearing these pop, pop noises. And I asked the guy next to me, what's that? And he turned around. I remember this quote said, man, they're bucking at the school again. And then just shook his head like, oh, that's a disrespectful thing to be doing. And then we just went and ran our, laps. But I mean, so just the idea of death, and of course, that's not comparably being hit by a tank, which is pretty impressive. I mean, I know a lot of people hit by bullets, tanks less so. But I mean, this basic idea that if you are, I mean, the majority of men used to have military experience, although not necessarily at your level. I mean, the number of people from working class neighborhoods like the South Side, very high, at least it has been. You know, even things like auto wreck. I was driving, when Jane and I first met, we were driving in downtown East Aurora, which is kind of the hood. And this drunk Greek dude just hit us, like T-boned the side of the car. We got out kind of expecting to fight with him, but he was in no shape to do much of anything. His family ended up showing up. Ambulances showed up. It was weird because this is like the third time we'd met. But I mean, in terms of the level of risk inherent in life, yeah, I don't think you can spend all of your days panicked. You'd never drive a car. You'd never shoot a gun. You'd never have sex. None of this means, again, that you should round up 50 people and hold a COVID-19 party. But the basic idea of, can you put on a mask and go to work? Yes, I think that the huge majority of people would do that. The question I have is why so many people are encouraging us not to. And I think that to some extent it's just protectionism. Many of these people are doctors. They really do care. But I also think there's an element of agenda setting here, where people from Clyburn to Andrew Yang have said very openly, this is a great time to get national basic income through. This is a great time to really change some of these policies around disease care. And I think that that's only possible if people are scared enough. Maybe the goal.
Maybe. Well, my other goal here is to help you sell these books. So if you guys want to be uncomfortable and talk about or read about things you can't talk about, you should buy Wil's book, Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About, to include things like white privilege and does it exist or not, racial violence and does it exist or not, and those kind of things. Wil is a fantastic writer. Go to Amazon, buy that book, and you will read things that will make you mad at yourself for believing it, because he throws the empirical evidence at you, and I know you'll love it. I enjoyed reading it. And anytime you buy a book, make sure that you rate and review it, because that really is besides the dollar or so that Wil gets from that book purchased, those ratings and reviews, as they stack up, that bumps the book up in the ratings and helps him sell more books. And that's one of the things that we want to do, is support Wil, because he's going big places. And shoot, man, I appreciate the hell out of you for coming on the show today.
Of course, man. I appreciate you having me. I'm down to be on the show pretty much any time. We've done some pretty interesting ones. Bob Woodson, Dan Crenshaw. So yeah, thanks for bringing me on. Not much more to say. This is me on the Break It Down Show.